This is the Comics Alternative Manga, reviews of Servant X Service and Sweet Blue Flowers, Volume 1. Hello, and welcome to another episode of the Comics Alternative Manga. I'm Derek.
And I'm Shea.
And we're two guys who love to talk about manga. And on the November episode of the manga series, Shea and I are going to look at two rather interesting and quite different titles. We're going to begin with Karino Takatsu's Servant X Service, Volumes 1 and 2. And then after that, we're going to look at the first volume of Sweet Blue Flowers by Takako Shimura. Before we get to those titles, though, we want to let all of you know that this episode of the Comics Alternative Manga is brought to you by the great folks at Discount Comic Book Service. Go to their website, dcbservice.com, for all of your comics pre-ordering needs. There, you're going to find all DC, Marvel, Image, and Dark Horse titles at 40% off of the cover price if you pre-order. For all of the other publishers, you'll find that those discounts are 20 to 35% off of the cover price, and every single month you're going to find some unbelievable specials. Sometimes those specials could be as much as 45% off of the cover price, sometimes 50% off of the cover, but every now and again you can find discounts that are even more impressive than that.
Like this month, you can buy volumes of Ai Yazawa's Paradise Kiss for 25% off, and you can buy Moto Hagio's Heart of Thomas, which we've talked about on the show before, for 37% off.
That's right. You know, whether you like your comics Western style or Asian, you can find great deals on those titles at Discount Comic Book Service. Go to dcbservice.com. They will take care of all of your comics pre-ordering needs, comics as well as manga. And after you do get your titles there, please be sure to send them an email and tell them that Shea and Derek sent you. Well, Shea, here we are on the other side of Thanksgiving. I guess we're in the thick of the holiday season now. I hope your Thanksgiving was good.
It was. Nicole and I, my fiance, we went over to her parents, and we had a really wonderful dinner. So it was a pretty nice, laid back, enjoyable Thanksgiving.
Yeah. So you get along well with her parents?
Yes. We are over there all the time, and we've got a pretty good relationship.
Well, good. That's good to hear. Yeah, it was an enjoyable Thanksgiving for me. I made it back, as you know, to Frisco, Texas, to be with my family for Thanksgiving. And in fact, you and I had wanted to get together and hang out for a bit while I was there in the Dallas area, but we just weren't able to do it.
Yes, I'm dealing with the end of semester, first semester of graduate school crunch. I've got about 60 or 70 pages of papers I have to churn out over the next couple weeks.
Yeah.
So,
yeah, I remember that sucky feeling.
But it'll be over soon, and then I can relax.
Yeah. And it was unfortunate that you couldn't join several of us on the annual Thanksgiving episode of the Comics Alternative.
Yes, there was a mix-up. I was bad about checking my email for a couple days, and I happened to miss crucial email. So I would have liked to have been there, but it's my own dang fault that I couldn't be.
Yeah, in fact, there were at least a couple of things that I mentioned that I was thankful for this past year that were manga related. One of those was I was thankful that Kodansha over the past 12 months has been putting out quite a number of nice deluxe editions and repackaging, like the Akira, which came out a few months ago. That really nice set, which I don't have, but hey, it's nice. But then the Ghost in the Shell series that you and I discussed several months ago.
Yeah, don't get me started on that Akira box set. It's been all I can do to keep from buying that beautiful, I think 35th edition is the new designs on the hardcovers, and it comes with the Akira Club art book. I'm going to work myself up into a lather just thinking about it. But yeah, I am also thankful for Kodansha's making that move to republish some of their older titles in these really beautiful editions. I know next month we plan on talking about a recent re-release, Battle Angel Alita, and when my copy showed up, I was really shocked almost to see the format they were publishing it in. It's much bigger than a trade, or it's not much bigger, but it's slightly bigger than the trade paperback size, and it's in this nice hardcover with beautiful paper. So yeah, their recent program to re-release some of those classic titles in formats that they really deserve has been really terrific this year.
Yes. Now, the second manga-related item that I was thankful for this past year that I mentioned on the Thanksgiving show was I was thankful that Ini Asano's Goodnight Pun Pun wrapped up. And in fact, this year, I think there were the last 4 volumes were released, and the final one, number 7, came out not too long ago. I think maybe last month or the month before. And the reason I'm thankful for that is not that I'm glad that, it's the end of the series, because, I really love it. It's one of my favorite titles over the past 2-3 years of anything that I've read, and I really enjoy it, so I'm sad to see it go. But the reason that I'm thankful is that it's not an ongoing series, let's say, a la One Piece, that goes on forever, right? So after this 7th volume that most recently came out of Goodnight Pun Pun, that's it.
Yeah, I like... I'm a big fan of series like that. There are a few volumes. They're substantive. There's a certain amount of heft to them, literally speaking. But they are finite.
Like Sunny that we discussed earlier this year.
Yes, which was a favorite of I know of mine, and I believe of yours from the last few years. Right. But I do like those. I have a difficult time getting into series that are exceptionally lengthy, such as of One Piece. Though I am a big fan of JoJo's Bizarre Adventure, which has been running for 30 years. So I guess there's always an exception to the rule.
Yeah, and in fact, JoJo's Bizarre Adventure is one of the very first manga titles that we discussed on this series.
Yes, and I know we've brainstormed an episode where we will come back to a number of titles, and unfortunately, JoJo's is just far too long to revisit.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah, and what Shea's referring to is the fact that sometime in the new year, we're not exactly sure when, but what we're going to do is we're going to, on the monthly manga show, look at 2, maybe 3 titles that we looked at the first 1 or 2 or 3 maybe volumes about a year or 2 ago, but we want to come back to them as they've wrapped up. So expect that sometime in early 2018. But for now, we're going to discuss 2 titles that are either very recent or relatively recent. And we're going to begin with the relatively recent title, Servant X Service. This is by Karino Takatsu, and it's published through Yen Press. And this is in 2 volumes. In print, Volume 1 came out in April of 2016, and then the second volume came out in June of 2016. So Servant X Service is one of those titles that we were referencing earlier, right? It's substantial, but it's definitely containable. I mean, you have basically 2 volumes, each of which is, not quite 300 pages. So it's not backbreaking, either to read or to pick up. But it has been released in English over the past, I say, 18 months or so. Now, have you read any of Takatsu's work in the past?
I hadn't. This was both a title and a cartoonist that I had really no familiarity with. I just know that I think it came about because Yen Press mentioned making review copies available, and we both thought that the series sounded interesting enough that we would take a look at it. But beyond that, I really had no knowledge of it. So there were a couple things about the series that we can talk about in more detail later on. But that really surprised me because I really had no clue what this series was or what it was about, or how this cartoonist drew or wrote really before opening the book. But what about you? Is this something that you a title you had maybe heard of or were aware of before this, or?
Actually, how I discovered this title, and I think I recommended that we may want to consider this for a future episode earlier this year. I happened to be in a Books A Million in their manga section, and I came across these 2 volumes, and I didn't know at first if it was only 2 volumes or if these are just 2 volumes of an ongoing series. And so I was flipping through the first volume and saw that it dealt with civil servants, and that the way that the story was arranged, and we can discuss this further in more depth, in I guess what you could call strip-like manner, right? I mean, there's something about Servant X Service that's very much like comic strips in the newspaper. And I thought, okay, well, this will be different. So I suggested that we look into it after Yen Press said that, yeah, sure, we'll send you review copies, which is always helpful. And, we've said before that we're thankful to publishers who do send us, if not physical copies, then digital copies of their books if we're considering discussing them on the show. And that does go a long way with us, because if we can't get the books easily enough, then we may not end up discussing a title. So it's really good that publishers like Yen Press, and then later we'll talk about Sweet Blue Flower, same thing with VIZ Media. They were really helpful in sending us a copy of this first volume of that book. But yeah, so that's how I found out about this, and so I'm glad that you wanted to go along with it. Yeah.
Now, I guess we can start to get into the book, because there's something you mentioned that was an aspect of the book that I really wanted to talk about, which is the kind of form of the book. And you mentioned that they are kind of these comic strips, and they are actually this style of comic strip called the yonkoma, which is they're always 4 panels. They're gag strips. They're very similar to listeners who may not be familiar with this format. They're very similar to American comic strips, except they're organized vertically. So like a page of service or servant service, they are the right side of a page is given over to one strip or one yonkoma, and then the left side vertically is given over to another one. And that was an aspect of the book that really I mentioned before opening the book and being really surprised by the format. And that was really the thing that stood out to me, because I don't think I've ever read, I've been aware of the format and I've seen shorter examples, and I've seen it maybe incorporated into other comics. But I don't think I've ever read a longer form or serialized Japanese comic that took that format and relied primarily on it. So I thought that was interesting, but at the same time, my reading experience was, I thought the series was fine, but there were so many things about it that just weren't really to my taste. And part of that was the way that Takatsu draws. There's just an aesthetic there that is I've seen a number of places, but there's just a sleekness to a lot of their drawings that I don't find particularly compelling. And the yonkoma format, which I thought was strange because there were certain strips that I thought worked really well as these kind of self-contained, discrete units, and there were others where there were elements of the story that were more kind of overtly serialized, and then still others. There were ones where panels between columns, these columns of these strips would be like kind of fused to be one larger panel, or one whole column would be given over to a single image, and so there wasn't. And so, it's only been a couple days since I've read these, so I'm still trying to think through whether or not I think the format itself was just not really. It's just a way of pacing that I just don't. I'm not thrilled by, or whether it was that kind of inconsistency almost of the use of the format. Yeah, I just had a difficult time really getting into the serial in the same way that I've easily gotten into some of the other titles we talked about. But how was your experience of the yonkoma format? Was this a format that you had any kind of knowledge of or experience with before opening this book? Or
not in this manner? I guess more like the occasional strip, if we want to call it that you would see it, kind of like you mentioned, every now and again. But this is the first time that I've read manga where the story is sustained through this kind of storytelling style, this type of comic, or this style of manga. And so it was a challenge. On the one hand, that's what intrigued me about Servant X Service. On the other hand, it took me a while to get used to it. So, for instance, when I started the first volume, I think I was maybe about a quarter of the way through, and then I got into the groove of the rhythm. Mm-hmm. And you're right. It is very much like, I guess, what we would call a gag strip. And I agree with what you've said, that sometimes the gags work, some work better than others. Not all of the book is structured like this. I mean, there are those occasional, although rarer sections where a particular chapter includes what you would consider, I guess, more traditional manga type of storytelling for maybe 2 pages or 3 at the most. And then we go back to that strip format. So once I got used to it, I think it worked well. And I really didn't give the format much of a second thought after I got into the rhythm of it. The parts of this series that I don't want to say annoyed me, but made me momentarily leave the story and think, well, this doesn't make sense, or why doesn't this character think things through a little more logically? It just doesn't make sense. Was with some of the character actions. But again, I'm expecting maybe a more rational way of looking at relationships. And I think, we mentioned that this is a series about civil servants. It's not so much about the civil servant occupation. It's about relationships. And so I think to some degree, not completely, but to some degree, you could take the characters in this story and make them workers in a non-government business or organization, and you would still have some of the same things going on. I mean, you would lose some of what the Takatsu is focusing on here at times, but I think the relationship element is something that really stands out. And as I was expecting the relationships to make a little more sense, if they did, most of the comedy would be gone. And even though I think that the kind of comedy here in this series may not necessarily be the kind of comedy that I would normally gravitate toward. I think for a lot of people, it's something that they would appreciate and get a kick out of. And from what I could gather, this series had a rather loyal following. And I think part of the reason may be the style of Takatsu, because there are those moments where her art is a little more detailed, especially when we're focused on a particular character as she or he may be speaking. But there are other times when the art becomes a little more stripped down, bare, and I guess we could say iconic. And usually those are moments that where characters display emotions. And so someone gets worked up, or someone's in love, or has a heartthrob, or gets irritated or something, and it's almost as if the visual perspective pulls back, not in terms of a long shot, but in terms of the detail of the art. And so we get the bare minimum of the shape of their head, their clothes, maybe some other things that they're wearing. And so there's not a lot of detail there. And so in that way, much of the art becomes easily cute. And I think that does appeal to maybe a wide readership. Again, not necessarily my bag, but I can see where this would be a draw to many readers of manga.
Yeah, I'm glad you mentioned that. There is this, we've mentioned a couple times that they are structured as these sort of gag strips, and the comic is a sort of like workplace comedy, and I actually really liked that use of that chibi tradition.
That's chibi. Yeah,
that Takatsu would utilize frequently to kind of deliver the punchline for a joke. And so, like you, I can definitely see why this series might have been popular, because of some of the way it's utilizing some of those very familiar aesthetic tropes. Now, one thing I was thinking about was, we read this both in these collected editions, these like 300 per page volumes that are slightly larger than the tankobon size, but they're pretty good sized books, both in terms of like dimensions and in page count. Now, I actually have no idea how this was originally serialized, but presuming that it was serialized similar to how American comic strips are serialized in a maybe like a daily or a weekly newspaper or manga magazine. Do you think your reading experience would have been different? Do you think you might have enjoyed it more if you were reading it maybe like a strip a day or a strip a week, rather than reading them in sequence? Or do you think that the yonkoma format and reading so many of them in so close together, you think that was negatively affected your reading experience, or do you think it really didn't have much bearing on it?
I think that's a great question, and it's something that reminds me of a topic that Sean and I on the webcomic series brings up every now and again. And what I mean by that is there are some webcomics that we've looked at, especially longer ongoing ones, whether they're completed or currently still being published in installments when we review it, that may be classics and has a very passionate and wide following. But when we've read them for the show, for me at least, it doesn't have the same kind of impact. And I'm thinking here in particular of the webcomic Menage a 3. And, a lot of people think that that's a standout webcomic, very devoted following. When I read it, and I can't remember Sean's reaction, I wasn't that impressed. And after a while, the story became a little monotonous. And I think that was because I was reading it at one time in big chunks. And so my reading experience, I think, would have been vastly different if I had been reading it every now and again, like every other day. as the strips came out. And so I'm thinking that maybe the same experience would have happened in reading Servant X Service, right? I mean, I got where everything was going, and I appreciated the overarching storylines well enough. But I think that this kind of format of storytelling is something that maybe readers are able to better appreciate as the segments come out. Mm-hmm. You know, like you mentioned, like in newspaper or magazine installments, either daily, weekly, monthly, or what have you, then all at once in completed volumes. And, you know, there are only 2 volumes of Servant X Service because so after volume 2, there is, I guess, a series of resolutions. And so what Takatsu does is to tie up all of her storylines, I think, rather neatly. I think one could argue a little too neatly, but then again, this is a comedy or a romantic comedy, so I wouldn't expect anything other than a neatly tied up storyline or storylines. So that didn't bother me. But I think that, to get back to your question, if I had read these strips as they were coming out, maybe I would appreciate it a little more than in taking everything in one big gulp.
Yeah, that's I kind of had a similar feeling as I was finishing up my reading. I started to think that you know, I may have been more receptive to some of the things, like certain not the plot per se, but, you know, and we can talk about this in a second. We can kind of explicate more fully what the comic is about. But the comic operates in a milieu that it's just never really been my bag. And so, but I began to feel as I was finishing the second volume that I might have been more receptive to some of that stuff and some of the aesthetic stuff that, again, just isn't really my cup of tea. If I was reading it, you know, in these like much smaller chunks. I know the cartoonist and comics critic Daryl Io once tweeted about how stupid it is to read those collected editions of Peanuts or Calvin and Hobbes in like one sitting, because you start to get really, and this is absolutely true because I've tried to read those volumes in one sitting. You get very tired of the way those strips always begin by recapitulating the previous strip or so. It becomes very like tiresome. And Daryl Io's point was that, yes, of course, because they weren't designed to be read like that in a sequence like that. They were designed to be read, you know, 5 days a week, or Monday through Friday, and then a Saturday, or they're like a Sunday strip or something. In the case of Calvin and Hobbes, and I think that's a super salient point that we need to think about as we're reading something like servant service in a format like this.
Now you're calling it servant service. Do you not pronounce the X there?
That's a great question. I have no idea. I know there's another title called Hunter. It's spelled Hunter X Hunter. And I always assumed it was Hunter X Hunter, but I thought I had heard some people pronounce it Hunter Hunter. And they did it with such confidence that I assumed they knew what they were talking about. So I think it is servant service, but this is one of those things that my knowledge is second or third or fourth hand, and so I could be completely wrong, and some listener could be laughing at me as we speak.
Yeah. And you know, it's interesting because every time the title is spelled, and I'm looking in particular here on the copyright page, it is servant and then X service. So is it X? Is it times? Is the X a stand-in for some other reference or symbol? I mean, I don't know. So that's why I've been calling it servant X service.
Yes. I know I think in the volumes we have the the X is much closer in font size. It's much more like uniform with the words. But I mean, just on the Wikipedia page for the title, the when it has it in the original Japanese, the X is rendered as this. It's this very like small notation. It looks almost like an exponent. So I don't know how we are supposed to read that. It could very well be servant X service, but I don't know for sure.
But if that is a symbol for like a multiplication, then servant times service would make sense given the story and the setting.
Yes.
And actually, this may be a good way of getting into what this story is all about. And I was thinking, with this strip format that you mentioned earlier, reading narrative forms like this may not be that productive because you can't appreciate it as it was presented serially. And I was thinking that with some of the character personalities, and I'm thinking in particular of two of the main characters here, and that is Lucy and then Hasebe, their characteristics after a while became a little tiring. And I'm thinking in particular of Lucy's obsession over her name or finding out about the person, the civil servant who actually approved her name, and we'll get to that in a moment. And then Hasebe's reluctance, especially in the second volume, to really be upfront and come clean with Lucy about his hand in her naming, so to speak. And we don't want to give away any spoilers here. But his agonizing over whether to tell her or not. I don't want to say that it rose to the level of Hamlet, right? Trying to decide whether, he will or won't kill Claudius. But this kind of wrangling back and forth with himself of what he should do and then putting off his actions became tiresome after a while. But I think that Lucy's concern with her name and then Hasebe's wrangling with himself over, what to tell Lucy, that would have been a little more palatable and enjoyable if I had read this as it was originally intended to come out serially through, and I think the magazine that it was published in originally was Big Gangan. That would have been okay because those kind of allusions to character and personality are callbacks, and it provides a sense of familiarity with a narrative, right? So, we may not see installments of Servant X service or whatever we choose to call it, just several times a month. But in most of those strips, we do get a little taste of a particular character or characters' personalities and their idiosyncrasies. And that's a familiar point to where you can build upon the character and the story, and you appreciate where the author is going. But when you read all of these strips in one sitting, it can become a little too much, almost monotonous.
Yeah, that's exactly what I was talking about. I felt like reading it in this format might have been a much more kind of repetitive experience than if I was reading it, weekly or monthly or so in these much smaller increments. I would have been. Not only would I have been much more forgiving for some of the elements of recapitulation that you just mentioned, but they would have been ideal because I wouldn't have been so aware. They wouldn't have been so present in my memory, and so it wouldn't have even occurred to me to get kind of tired of this constant précis almost of previous strips. So yeah, I think I was pretty lukewarm on the series. And again, I think that has a lot to do with just my kind of personal animosity towards some of the stuff that the book was doing and the kind of milieu it was working in. I was kind of predisposed to just not be super keen on that particular genre, shall we say. But I think I would have been much more open to it and much more receptive to it had I spread out my reading over a much longer period of time.
Right. Now, in talking about the personalities of the characters in this series, I think that gets us to the heart of the story. As we've mentioned a few times, this does take place in a civil servant office, and we have, as I guess you can call it, the one main. If we had to pick just one main character, it would be Lucy Yamagami. Although her name is not just Lucy Yamagami. I mean, Lucy is obviously more of a Western name, but the thing is, she has, I don't know how long, I can't even remember if her entire name is ever laid out.
It's not. It's like,
it's always abbreviated by an ellipsis of some sort or an et cetera. And basically, what happened is that right before she was born, as she tells us, the reader, and then her coworkers, her parents were asking others what would be a good name for, our daughter to be. And so people would give suggestions of good names, and they had this long list of names. They could never decide on what exactly to call her. So when they went to register her official name with the civil service of their local city, then they included all of those names. And so she goes by Lucy because it's the easiest of all the names given the length of everything. But then it's Lucy, name, at infinity, it seems, Yamagami. But it's always shortened to Lucy, and we have about a few names, etc., Yamagami. And one of the main storylines in Servant X Service is that Lucy has become a civil servant so that, not only is it a job that's secure, but she hopes to meet the person, the civil servant, who actually approved of her parents giving this long list of names that eventually became her official legal name, because her thoughts are no decent civil servant would have approved this, right? And so it's the civil servant's fault more than it is the parents, because they were overcome with this being their first child. And so, of course, you could excuse that to a point, but they were a little overzealous with the names there. But the civil servant should have said, no, just choose 2 or 3 tops and that's it. But so she wants to find out, who is this person who approved this? I want to give them a piece of my mind. And that is a storyline that runs throughout the entire series. And eventually some of the other characters, especially the love interest, or who the guy who becomes her love interest, Yataka Hasebi, he becomes involved in this in some way, especially in the second volume. We don't want to give anything away, no spoilers, but things kind of do come to a head with the name in this relationship between Lucy and Hasebi. But then there are other characters as well who are civil servants whose personalities, I guess, are idiosyncratic and at times even wacky. In this way, Servant X Service reminded me, as a romantic comedy, of another manga title that I really enjoy and I think does this genre much better, and that is Rumiko Takahashi's Meisou no Koku, where you have a lot of weird and wacky characters in one place. But in the case of Meisou no Koku, that one place is an apartment. Mm-hmm. And so you have these strange characters all living in the same area and the same building, and it's the kind of weirdness and wackiness that ensues from their strangeness intermingling, right? And you have something similar going on here in Servant X Service, but the locale or what binds everyone together is the civil servant office.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I haven't read that particular Rumiko Takahashi series, so I was not reminded of that. But this series gave me like strong. It made me think most prominently of something like The Office.
Yes. Okay, that's a good one.
These shorter, serialized, comedic office romance things. And so that was kind of the headspace I was in as I was reading it. And like I said, that's just not it's just not a milieu that I love. You know, I'm not a huge fan of The Office. Just as and it really has a lot to do with just that setting and that conceit to establish these character relationships and problematize and dramatize those relationships. It just hasn't really appealed to me. And so that was, I think, one of the things about servant service that just made it really difficult for me to get into, because it was working in this genre and employing these conventions and these tropes that I've just found to not be really effective on me. Mm-hmm. They've always just left me cold. How did you feel about the book using some of those tropes? Was that something that you are more kind of amiable to, or what?
Yeah, well, let me just say I'm a big fan of The Office, especially the American version of The Office. A lot of people say, "Oh, I prefer the UK version." I'll have to tell you, I've watched a few episodes of Gervais's UK Office, and maybe it's because I'm just not a Ricky Gervais fan by any means. There's something about him that really gets on my nerves, and so I can't watch the UK Office. But I'm a big fan of Steve Carell and the US The Office. And, you mentioned, I'm glad you made that link to The Office. You have a lot of weird characters and also office romances going on within this confined space, right? And so the setting, the location is relatively almost claustrophobic, self-contained, kind of a petri dish, right? Where you throw these various characters and the weirdness and the personalities into it to see what kind of transpires, right? What kind of brew do we have in throwing all these strange characters together? I think we have a Michael type character in Servant X Service, Michael from The Office. In this office's manager, which is Taishi Ichimiya, because he's ineffective. Now, he's not as bumbling as Michael of The Office, but he is ineffective, and he can't bring himself to actually be effective. I mean, he wants to, but that's just not the kind of personality he has. Ichimiya also has a younger sister who is obsessed with the civil service, and of course her brother. And so that becomes a strange relationship throughout this series. Ichimiya is also involved in a relationship of his own. He is, quote unquote, dating Megumi Chihaya, and Chihaya is not a full-time employee like almost all the other characters are. She's a temp, but she works in the civil service office, and the thing that defines her personality is that she is obsessed with cosplaying, and she can't have a relationship that is not framed in some way by her love of cosplaying. So in befriending people, whether it be, let's say, Ichimiya's younger sister, or let's say her relationship with Lucy, it always has to involve some type of cosplay. And in fact, the thing that draws Lucy to Chihara is, I guess, a defining physical characteristic of Lucy, and that is her breast. She apparently has a larger than average bust, at least from all the other women who were in this series. And, not only do the men, and I guess in particular Hasebi, make comments about it, but it's not so much the men who observe this, it's the women in the story, and not just Chihaya, but other women in this series also keep making comments about the size of her breast. And so Chihaya thinks that Lucy would look wonderful in a variety of cosplay outfits just because of her cleavage. And then we have another office worker who's a full-timer, Saya Miyoshi. And the thing that defines her is that she's quiet, demure, and she seems to be able to put up with a lot, especially from citizens who come in to complain or just talk constantly, the most notorious of which is someone named Mrs. Tanaka. And in fact, Mrs. Tanaka is someone who comes into the civil service office, talks to Miyoshi about her daughter-in-law, but then later she tries to set Miyoshi up with her grandson, Tanaka, which becomes Jigori is, I think, his name, which sounds like Gregory. And in fact, I think a few times they refer to him as Gregory. He has a strange personality as well. But there are other weird people. Like, for instance, the office director is someone who is so shy that he never appears in the office or in public as himself. He has to, and correct me if I'm wrong, I think I have this right. He has some kind of recording and observing device set into an animated bunny doll. And so he speaks through the bunny, and I guess the bunny doll also has cameras where he can see what's happening. Mm-hmm. He can manipulate it. And it's never explained why he does this outside of the fact that he's extremely shy. But that was one of those weird things that the more I read and realized as I got further into the series, this is never really going to be explored or explained why the office director does this. It's like, okay, it's weird. I'll go with it.
Yes, that was my understanding of his deal too. But that was one of the elements of the series that I ended up kind of enjoying the most or getting the most kick out of, because it is something that it is
Kenzo, the
odd.
director.
Yeah, Kenzo Momoi.
Momoi, yeah.
Yeah, that was an aspect of it's just like you said. It is unexplained. It is odd. It is kind of this like over elaborate way for him to like engage with the world. But I think I enjoyed it more than some of the other elements of the book, precisely because it was so just kind of like inexplicable and like odd. And it was just this thing that everyone just kind of like they like worked around and they lived their lives around this like very weird kind of detail. And everything else just felt kind of much more by the book. Mm-hmm. Whereas this detail was just like you said, okay, I guess let's just go with it. There's an element of that little detail in the book that I thought was missing from some other elements, and I think it's why that the section chief appearing as a stuffed rabbit I got so much of a kick out of.
Yeah, that is something that was just so over the top that you just. Okay, don't try to understand it. Just enjoy it. It was so wacky. You're right. It was one of the more enjoyable elements of this series.
It is wacky. Wacky, I think, is the perfect word to describe that detail.
Yeah. And in that sense, it was something akin to. I know you made a reference to a television show, The Office, but I can't help but think of Gilligan's Island.
Yeah, that's not a comparison I would make, but I can definitely see how you might make that connection. Yeah.
Now, did you said that this type of story, this romantic comedy, is with a lot of unusual characters, isn't that really something that you gravitate toward? Mm-hmm. When you got to the end of the second volume, did you appreciate how the author Takatsu kind of wrapped things up rather neatly, and I think in a really concise, self-contained manner, because this is again a limited series?
Yeah, that's a good question. I definitely do appreciate that there was some sort of conclusion and that it didn't become this just very protracted and drawn out soap opera, which is, I think, The Office is, I think, the most prominent example of this kind of series. Mm-hmm. But you see it, a ton. They're usually all comedies. I mean, I was just watching, we just got Hulu, so I was watching that show Superstore, which is, it's a very similar conceit, except instead of an office, they work in essentially a Walmart. But there's a number of series like this, and they either are no good and they get canceled very quickly, or they're very popular and they go on for a number of years and they become this, like Cheers. They dragged out the will they, won't they, sexual tension, romantic tension between these two characters. And there's always just only so long a relationship like that can go on before it just becomes interminable. And so, I definitely appreciate Takatsu ending their series. And I don't know if that was by choice or something from editorial, but I did definitely appreciate that there was some sort of ending. And I think they handled that ending well. But I don't think it was. I don't think the landing or the conclusion was strong enough that it kind of turned me around on the series. But I did like that it did have a conclusion and it had an ending. And I thought that sets it apart from a lot of these other series in this subgenre that I find myself kind of rolling my eyes at.
Yeah, because I feel that had Takatsu extended this series beyond, let's say, a second, third, fourth volume, or at least the kind of volume sizes that we have with the English translation from Yen Press, then it definitely would have worn things thin. And like I said, with some of these character traits, by the time I got to the last part of the second volume, I was beginning to tire of some of the personalities, again, because I'm reading everything at once, right? Instead of in installments, every several days or once or twice a month. But I think that for the length that it is, it's okay.
Was there, before we move on to our next title, was there any other details or dimensions of servant service that you wanted to make sure that you touched on?
No, I think that I think we've mentioned and covered most of the things that I wanted to bring up. I think this is a title that, and I don't mean this in a negative way, it's light reading or lighter reading than I think most of the other things that we've been discussing on this manga series for the past couple of years or so. And it's something that you can easily pick up and put down and not really feel that you've lost or missed anything by picking it up and putting it down, reading it every now and again, right? I mean, there's some narratives, manga and otherwise, that I feel at least that if I pick up and put down too frequently, then I lose the rhythm of the story and even forget some of the major content elements, right? So I need to read it in larger chunks in order to fully appreciate what's going on, both in terms of the narrative and the art, the aesthetics, all of that. But I think with Servant X Service, it's the kind of story, kind of like the strip format that we were discussing earlier, where you can pick up and put down multiple times throughout the day or the week or the month and not really feel that you're missing out on a lot by doing that. In other words, the serial format of the storytelling kind of feeds into the ways that you can consume this narrative, and that is in little bits and pieces, and that's okay. And I think because of this kind of storytelling, I feel that it is something that you don't have to think about very much, right? You can just enjoy it. It's something almost like comfort food.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I do think that is something I'm glad you mentioned before we move on, that it is a book that it's formatted to really work well with picking up, reading in small chunks, putting down, and then picking up at some, it's something that you can kind of pick up and drop at kind of various points with ease, unlike some of the other titles we've talked about, which are much, I think, better suited to reading in one sitting or in a couple sittings close together.
Well, Shea, you want to move on to the second title that we are discussing this month?
Yes, let's move on to Sweet Blue Flowers.
Volume 1, this is by Takako Shimura, and this first volume came out in September of this year. Volume 2 actually comes out on the 19th of December. This is published through VIZ Media. You and I were talking right before we turned the recorder on. I had asked you if you had read any Takako Shimura previously, and you said you hadn't. And I think the thing that Shimura is most known for is Wandering Sun, which Fantagraphics published that series several years ago. In fact, some of those volumes are now out of print, which is kind of frustrating, right? For those who may, like me, who got the first one or two volumes and then didn't continue getting them as they were coming out. I think volume 3 and maybe even 4 are now out of print.
That's really interesting because I thought they were just now finishing the series. I thought they were just now coming out with the final volumes.
I may be wrong, but I think that Fantagraphics wrapped that up a while back. I can't remember when, and I can't even remember how many volumes are in that series.
Huh.
But I think that's primarily how I was introduced to Takako Shimura. So I didn't really know about Sweet Blue Flowers until Viz solicited this first volume several months back. And then, we got in touch with the publicist at VIZ Media. Cyrus, very kind, sent us copies. And I'm glad that he did because it made us... we decided once we got review copies. Yeah, we're gonna discuss this, and I have to say, of the two titles that we're looking at this month, Servant X Service or Servant Service, whatever you choose to call it, and then Sweet Blue Flowers. Sweet Blue Flowers, I appreciated much more. One thing, not that I didn't like Servant X Service, it's just that I like Sweet Blue Flowers a lot more. I think it's a more sophisticated narrative, and what it has in common with the previous title that we were discussing is that it is a romance.
Yes.
So that is, I think, the common ground between these two series. But where they veer from each other is that whereas Servant X Service I would describe as a romantic comedy, Sweet Blue Flower, it's a romance or comedic romance. Sweet Blue Flowers is a romance. There's really not much of anything comedic about this. Another thing that distinguishes this title, and I think this is one of the things that also distinguish Wandering Sun, is we're dealing with issues of sexuality and non-normal, I guess, quote-unquote normal sexuality between characters. You had that going on with Wandering Sun, and with Sweet Blue Flowers, you have, I guess, an example of yuri manga, right? Girl love manga. Now, I know in the past you and I have discussed, maybe in passing, yaoi, boy love manga. And I think you mentioned at the top of the show during the sponsor bit that, The Heart of Thomas is an example of this boys love or yaoi. Is that how you pronounce it? Yaoi?
I can never remember.
Yaoi?
I've heard it a billion times, and I'm having just a difficult time. I always have a difficult time recalling how to correctly pronounce that.
But it's the boys' love genre. And so here we have Yuri, which is girls' love genre. And by girls' love and boys' love, we don't necessarily mean that this is a sexual attraction. It could be. Or it could be just strictly emotional, right? And that's what you have in the aforementioned Heart of Thomas, right? There may be something sexual there, there's some kind of sexual attraction. You don't know entirely for sure, but that really doesn't matter because there is definitely an emotional bond between the young boys in that title. And you have something similar going on here with Sweet Blue Flowers, that there is some kind of attraction girl to girl in this series. Now, it may manifest itself in sexual ways or have the potential to do that, but it's definitely emotional.
Yeah. I was trying to think if this was our first Yuri title on the show, but then I recalled that we did Revolutionary Girl Utena a little while back. But yeah, Yuri is a genre that we haven't talked a lot about on this show. So I am glad that we have this opportunity with Sweet Blue Flowers to dig into that subgenre or genre a little more fully.
Right. You know, we also discussed Kabi's My Lesbian Experience with Loneliness.
Oh, yes. That is true. And I know a listener sent us an email about that, but there will be a sequel to that coming out next year.
Yeah, Jason, who definitely keeps in touch with us about manga news, and we very much appreciate that. That's a title I would love to revisit. You know, we talked about a show where we revisit titles that we previously discussed. So, you know, if there's a sequel to My Lesbian Experience with Loneliness, I'd like for us to discuss that at some point. Yeah,
absolutely. Now, I know you mentioned that between the two titles we are talking about today, that you definitely enjoyed Sweet Blue Flowers a little more than Servant Service. And I had a pretty similar reading experience, but can you tell me a little bit about what about this series or this book, this first volume, really resonated with you more than the previous title?
Because the complexity or the granularity of the relationships involved in this series. And granted, you know, you and I have only read the first volume here of Sweet Blue Flowers. As you know, as I mentioned a little while ago, the second volume comes out in mid-December. So I'm curious to see how things develop. But with Servant X Service, the relationships and the personalities were painted, so to speak, with a broad brush. So emotions were exaggerated. Actions were at times over the top. The comedy was broad. And that's okay. There's nothing wrong with that. But with Sweet Blue Flowers, you know, also a narrative about relationships. There are just so many nuances and different levels to what's going on between and among these various characters. And whereas with Servant X Service, you had primarily, not exclusively, kind of a one-to-one relationship ratio going on, right? So, you know, Lucy had a love interest with Hasebi and vice versa. There is Ichimaya and Chihaya. There is Tanaka and Miyoshi. And yeah, there were other characters involved in some of these relationships, but for the most part, it was boy-girl relationship with just a little complication here or there with other characters. The thing about Sweet Blue Flowers is that you have characters who are attracted one to the other, but their relationship with, you know, one girl to another kind of resonates in ways that affects one's relationship with other girls who are characters in the series, or groups of girls. And so I like the way that it's kind of like you pluck on the string of a relationship and it reverberates by making other strings vibrate. And so one thing in one action and one decision about whether to like someone or, as they say, date someone can affect the way that other relationships play out. So I think this kind of complexity is what I really appreciated with this first volume of Sweet Blue Flowers, which you don't see as much by any degree with Servant X Service.
Yeah, that's. I think you hit the nail right on the head with what resonated. What about this series resonated with me? I think that Shimura does an excellent job of establishing these complex relationships. Sometimes relationships between two people. Sometimes it's a love triangle. Sometimes they're more complex with someone likes someone who likes this other person who has unrequited feelings for this other person. But I think what really struck me more than just that the relationships were complex. Getting to something that you said, the granular nature of these relationships, the way that Shimura plays out the contours of these relationships, these little moments that serve as kind of like axes of these relationships, I thought was really, really effective. And she delivers some really strong cartooning in this book in just little moments. I mean, she draws beautifully, and I would love to see a book of hers published entirely in I believe watercolors that we see on the cover of the book and the cover of the Japanese editions. And then I think there's a couple pages in the book itself that are watercolors. But I would like to see much more of that. But she draws beautifully. But I'm thinking of one scene in particular where it's just a really simple layout and simple sequence of, I think, 3 or 4 panels towards the end of the book, or maybe in the middle of that second section of I think it's Sugimoto. There's like a 3 or 4 panel sequence where she starts to cry, and there's just a level of just subtlety and detail as she kind of like starts to cry, as her tears start to well up, and then as she begins to cry, it's just this little moment. But I thought that Shimura, I thought it was an excellent example of what Shimura does well, which is rendering these very important emotional scenes in these very simple, elegant, easy to read, moving little sequences. I thought this was a terrific manga about relationships. I thought it was really, really well observed.
Right. This is another example of VIZ's, I guess what they call their signature editions, which I guess is something like a perfect edition. And we've looked at some of their perfect editions in the past. I think the most notable that comes to mind is Monster, one of the earliest mangas that we discussed together. But so basically what that is taking 2 volumes of a manga series and putting it into one book. And I really do appreciate that, not only in terms of economics, but I think that it works well in terms of the size of the actual physical book, its readability, not only in terms of the practicalness of holding a volume, but also in terms of getting more story within each, so to speak, volume in these kind of signature or even perfect editions. Now, we were talking about relationships and how they kind of interlink throughout this first volume. Now, the main relationship in Sweet Blue Flowers is between 2 girls, both of which are beginning high school as the series opens, although they're starting different high schools. There's Fumi Manjomi, and then there's Akira Okudera. And these are young girls who years ago, when they were little, had been friends and hung out, but they lost track. I think one may have moved away. I can't remember. But they lost track of each other. But then they meet up again as each of them are getting ready to go on their first day of school. And in fact, they meet, if I remember correctly, at the train station, where each is on her way to her particular high school. And they recognize each other. They start talking. And so they become friends again. And throughout this first volume, we get little glimpses into their past when they were friends as little girls, but their relationship developed even more as high school students. But they, at least in this first volume, the relationship between Fumi and Akira is not romantic. It's more strictly friendship. But where the romance comes in is with some other characters. So, for instance, Fumi goes to the same high school as Yasuko Sugimoto, and Yasuko Sugimoto is a very popular girl, very intelligent, very athletic. She's head of the basketball team. She's also notorious for using people, especially emotionally. And so she latches on to Fumi, and they began, I think as they describe it, dating. And this relationship also has repercussions not only with Fumi's relationship, her newfound relationship, or renewed relationship with Akira, but also relationships with other people in the book. I mean, another main character is Kyoko Akumi, and she's someone who attends the same school as Akira, but she begins to have what appears to be a crush or an attraction to Yasuko, but Yasuko doesn't seem to want to have much to do with Kyoko. And so already you have some complications fairly early on building, right? So if Fumi and Akira are friends and want to hang out, and Fumi becomes in many ways involved with Yasuko, and then Kyoko goes to the same school as Akira, can Fumi and Kyoko be near one another without there being some feelings of rivalry, at least on the part of Kyoko? And I know that someone who's not read this first volume is trying to make sense of what I've said and keep track of the names. It does become a little convoluted and confusing, but I think that that's part of what this series is all about, right? It's part of that granularity of the complexity of the relationships and how they're intermingled.
Yeah, I'm glad you mentioned the kind of complexity of it's not convoluted really. There's just a lot going on, and one of the things that I did want to talk about that as much as I enjoyed the book, and I think one of the deficiencies of it and one of the difficulties in reading it I had was that when I first started reading the book, through the first couple chapters, I did have a difficult time telling some of these characters apart, and some of that has to do with just how much is going on in some of those first chapters, establishing the characters and establishing their relationships. That you have to keep track of all of that in your head, but at the same time, some of the characters do look alike, and they're changing hairstyles over the course of a number of chapters, and so I found that to be a difficulty I had reading it. As the series got on, I became more familiar with the characters. It was easier to discern, but there is definitely an element of there's a lot going on, and there's a lot to keep straight in those first few chapters. Was that something that you experienced as well, or?
Yeah, I did, especially at first. But once I started to read some of the clues as to how Shimura distinguished one character from another, or one group of characters from another, it became a little easier to discern. Okay, who is this person? For example, Yasuko and Kyoko both have very similar hairstyles, very short, not quite bob, but very short. And they look the same in terms of the hairstyles. What distinguishes one from the other is Yasuko has darker hair, whereas Kyoko has lighter blonde hair, it seems, even though this is black and white. Another way to distinguish between some of the characters is the kind of uniforms that they're wearing. So the school that Fumi goes to has a very different uniform than the school that Akira goes to. And so if you see, let's say, Yasuko, and she's wearing one particular outfit that is the uniform of, what is it called, Matsuoka Girls High School, then, okay, so this is Yasuko and not Kyoko. But also, Yasuko has darker hair. But you're right, some of these characters at times, especially when you first get into this series, seem to look similar in ways that can be a little confusing, especially when you're thrown so many characters at the outset. Because there are even a number of minor characters that kind of look like some of the major players, but with subtle differences. And so you have to learn what those subtle differences are in order to tell who is who.
I'm trying to think of like what else I'd like to talk about with this book. Because like I did enjoy it quite a bit. I guess I'd be curious to know how you found Shimura's writing in terms of how she kind of paced the story. Was that something that you felt was like you thought that the slower kind of pace of the book lent itself well to that romantic or relationship drama genre that the book is operating with? You think it heightened some of those elements for you?
You know, the way you described it, you said the slower pace. When I read this first volume of Sweet Blue Flowers, I didn't think of it as slow-paced. And in fact, I had a much, I don't want to say easier, but quicker time reading this first volume of Sweet Blue Flowers than I did, let's say, one volume of Servant at Service. Servant at Service seemed to take a lot longer just because of some of those issues that we mentioned in the first half of the show. What could appear to some as kind of repetitiveness, right, of relationships or personalities or idiosyncrasies or what have you. And at times it's like, okay, this again, which made it seem a little longer than it actually was. But with Sweet Blue Flowers, I didn't think of it as slow-paced. But getting back to your question about Shimura's storytelling style, and again, we've only read this first volume, so I could feel different with, let's say, 2 or 3 more volumes under my belt, which I hope to get in the not-too-distant future. But with this first volume, I felt that, okay, yes, we do have these relationships that will more or less define and play themselves out, maybe slowly, depending on how you describe it, over the entire series, right? The relationship between Fumi and Akira, or between Fumi and Yasuko, and what these relationships have to do with other relationships that have started in this first volume, or future relationships that will develop as the series continues. But I do appreciate the fact that Shimura also, in this first signature volume, has a number of, I guess, what we could call mini storylines that make up different sections of this first book. And I'm thinking in particular of the part of this narrative, and this kind of spans what originally had been the last part of the first volume and the first part of the second volume in this first volume of the signature series from VIZ. And that is the drama club's play that they're performing. And the play that they're performing is an adaptation of Wuthering Heights. And Yasuko is the star, right? She plays the Heathcliff. And that makes perfect sense because in her relationship with Fumi, and we assume, or at least I assume, in her relationships with other girls in the past, she's the one who, for lack of a better way of phrasing this, played the more masculine role, right? The one who seemed to be the individual in the relationship taking charge. And so it makes sense that she's the one who plays the role of Heathcliff. Also, she's the one in this series that seems to have kind of a complicated dark past. And we just scratched the surface in this first volume. We don't know exactly what it is. So again, it makes sense that she plays the character Heathcliff in this play. But I think that this story within the story, if we want to call it that, this mini story of the drama club performing Wuthering Heights and everything that goes on surrounding the performance, the preparations, the actual performance itself, the aftermath, I think is a great way of pacing for the long haul, right? So you have the larger, slowly developing stories with these various relationships. But along the way, we have peppered throughout, I'm assuming, this series, little stories that will help to build to a larger narrative.
Yeah. I felt pretty similarly. I think some of the character work that Shimura does in this first volume, introducing a lot of it is really introducing some of these relationships or relationship triangles on the periphery of this these main relationships, I should say, between Fumi and Akira and Fumi and Sugimoto. Like you, I think there is something kind of beneath the surface for a lot of these characters that I would be interested in continuing to read the series and see how Shimura, see where she takes those characters and see how she develops some of the stuff that we only really get hints at of in this this first, I guess, what would have been in the original release, the first 2 volumes,
right,
or so.
Yeah. I tell you that the part of this first edition or the first signature volume that we're discussing here that I like the most is in the second half of the book. So it would have appeared, I guess, originally as the second volume of Sweet Blue Flowers. And this is when Fumi goes to Yasuko's home. And it's kind of an out-of-the-way place. It takes her a while to get there. And in fact, one of Yasuko's family's drivers that they employ actually comes to pick Fumi up. And so that kind of impresses Fumi, right? Because she comes from kind of a humble, not poor, but kind of, I guess, what you would call middle-class background. And so she's amazed that it's a driver that comes pick her up. And what we learn about Yasuko's family is she has 3 sisters, older sisters, one of which used to be a teacher at Akira's school. Is that correct? Fujigaya?
Yes.
Fujigaya's Women's Academy High, right. And in fact, Yasuko used to go to Fujigaya, but now she goes to Matsuoko Girls High School. We don't know exactly why she made that change. That's one of those little mysteries that's inserted and touched upon lightly, and I'm assuming we'll learn more about it as the series continues. Similar things going on with Yasuko's relationship with her sisters, because her older sisters are a little unusual. I mean, there's the one sister who's a teacher who seems to be the most normal of the other 3 older sisters. But then the others seem to have, if not contentious, then complicated relationships with their younger sister. And we don't know exactly what's going on with that family. We don't know exactly what has happened with Yasuko in her world, both family and school, to make her the kind of character that she seems to be in this first volume. And I really did appreciate the strange mix of the Sugimoto family when Fumi visits. And we get a brief glimpse into, Yasuko's past, but we don't know much yet. And so I'm assuming that we'll learn more in the volumes to come. And I really did enjoy that part of this first volume.
Yeah, I was just about to say that scene was one of my favorites from this first volume as well. I thought that was just being able to see Fumi and Sugimoto together and getting this kind of intrusion from Sugimoto's sisters that hint at aspects of the characters, that aspect of the character, I should say, of Sugimoto that we hadn't really been made aware of before. I thought that scene was really interesting, and the kind of the tension that incident or that sequence has on the relationship between Fumi and Sugimoto, I thought was handled really well. That was one of my favorite scenes from this book as well. So I'm glad you mentioned it.
Right. And then the sisters, along with the mother, make comments at one point about Yasuko and her relationship, not only with Fumi, but also with others from the past that, again, we don't get much detail about. But what it does is it opens the door into more possibilities as to who Yasuko actually is and what has she done. And does this have anything to do with the fact that she used to go to one high school and now attend one girls' school and now goes to another? Again, I mean, things are just briefly touched upon in this first volume, introducing mysteries that I'm assuming will be played out, maybe slowly, maybe not, in the volumes to come.
Yeah, and I'm glad. And that scene also is where we're invited to kind of problematize Sugimoto's sexuality, or our up to that point, like, notions of her sexuality. I think Fumi is more strictly gay, whereas Sugimoto, we get the implication that she is bisexual in that scene. And so there are these romantic and sexual dynamics between these characters that are maybe a little more fraught, a little more complicated than we had originally understood. So I thought that scene was great because it is it's so kind of small and elegant, but there's so much kind of like subtle and interesting work being done in the rendering of those relationships just in that scene alone.
Right. Yeah. And you mentioned Fumi being more, I guess, obviously attracted to just women, although we don't know that is entirely the case. But Yasuko Sugimoto does seem to have in the past feelings for men, especially older men. We won't go into too much detail there. And so there is some complication there. Fumi is the innocent in not only this relationship, but I think in other relationships that she develops, primarily friendships, even with Akira. She's the one who is more fragile, more innocent. She's the one who is learning things as she goes along, right? I mean, Yasuko is the one who seems to be world wise, even at that age. Fumi is someone who is an innocent. And whereas on the one hand, Akira, her young friend and now refound, is also in a sense an innocent, but she's someone who doesn't let things bother her. She's more, for want of a better phrase, happy-go-lucky. And so she can see that at times Fumi is a little too emotional and lets things get to her. So Akira doesn't take things as seriously as Fumi does. And so I think you have in this first volume an interesting setup of relationships. And I didn't even mention Kyoko Ikumi. I mean, she's someone who I think in certain ways is even more complicated than Yasuko, just because we don't know as much in this first volume about Kyoko as we learn about Yasuko.
Yeah. Kyoko is an interesting character because she does introduce this. she introduces this other kind of complicating dynamic in Sugimoto's relationship with Fumi, and that was another thing that we get a little bit of it throughout this first book, but it's something I would be really curious to see what Shimura does with that as she develops the story, like where she takes that character and their attractions and their kind of desires in terms of like the relationships they desire, what Shimura does with that going forward as the series kind of develops and progresses.
Mm-hmm. I know a question that each of us asks the other many times is when we read the first volume of an ongoing series for the podcast, will we go on to read additional volumes? So let me ask you, Shea, I mean, will you go on to read the next volumes of Sweet Blue Flowers?
That's a great question. I am terrible about actually following through and keeping up with these because I always I have to keep up with stuff for the show and now school and the comics I read for the AV Club. So I'm bad about actually continuing to keep up with series, but yes, Sweet Blue Flowers is a series that I would like to continue to keep up with, and I would continue to read because, like I said, there's a number of narrative elements in this first volume that I am really keen to see how Shimura develops those details or those characters or those relationships. And then, like I said, Shimura I think is a terrific illustrator. I mean, not just as a cartoonist, but I am a huge fan of the way she draws, and I think she does a great job of drawing facial expressions and like subtle changes in facial expressions, which lends itself really, really well to the relationship drama genre. But I have a feeling that your answer is going to be similar to mine. But do you think you'll continue to keep up with this series going forward?
Yeah. And to me, what's important in the answer is not so much will I actually continue reading or will you actually, but is the intention of wanting to read on there.
Yeah.
And yeah, definitely the intention of wanting to read on beyond this first volume of Sweet Blue Flowers is there. And I hope to. And like you, I mean, I have a lot of things competing for my attention in terms of reading. But if I don't get to volumes, let's say 2 and then 3 and so on, so on, of Sweet Blue Flowers immediately, I will eventually get to them.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
And that's how it is with other manga series that we discuss.
Yes.
Well, Shea, this, I guess in many ways we could call the relationship episode. November is the month for relationships.
Yes.
On the Comics Alternative manga series. We started with Karino Takatsu's Servant X Service, or if we want to call it Servant Service, from Yen Press. And then we discussed the first volume of Takako Shimura's Sweet Blue Flowers from VIZ Media. It's all about relationships.
Yes. November is for lovers.
Yeah. That's good. If you want to find great manga like the titles that Shea and I discuss, not only this month, but every month, then you would do well to check out the website of our sponsor, which is Discount Comic Book Service. Go to dcbservice.com, and there, every single month, you're going to find some incredible specials. So go to dcbservice.com and find out what the latest are. And after you do get your manga there, get in touch with us and let us know what you thought about this month's discussion. If you go to our website, comicsalternative.com, you'll find that you can leave us a voice message online via SpeakPipe. Or you can call us the old-fashioned way by picking up the phone and dialing 4153-COMICS. That's 415-326-6427.
Well, you can also email us. You can email the show at 2guys@comicsalternative.com. You can email me at shay@comicsalternative.com. And Derek, tell the good people your email address.
Believe it or not, at derek@comicsalternative.com. You can also find us all over social media, such as on Twitter, Facebook, Tumblr, Instagram, Google+, Goodreads, Pinterest, YouTube, and Slack. You can subscribe to the podcast through Apple Podcast. You can stream us on Stitcher. You can also find us on TuneIn, on Spotify, on iHeartRadio, and on Google Play Music. But you can find every single one of our podcast episodes, as well as the reviews and comics-related commentary that we post on our blog, simply by going to our website, comicsalternative.com. So a lot of ways for people to get in touch with us. And we do like to hear from you about the manga we discuss and even recommending titles that we can discuss in future episodes.
Yes, we really, really appreciate it when you guys do that. So continue to do it.
That's right. And in fact, one of our topics for next month that we've referred to already, Battle Angel Alita, was a suggestion from Jason, who keeps in touch with us. So we'll talk more about that in December. Until then, I'm Derek.
And I'm Shay.
Thanks for listening.